So I'm perusing videos on YouTube, and a thought occurs to me. Right now, in 2025, we have a guy porting Mortal Kombat 2 to the 3DO. He's in the process of beta testing, just as a hobby for the heck of it. It's free. This guy is writing his own version of the game that will work on a Panasonic 3DO, which is old technology and kind of rare because it was expensive. Simultaneously, there is a man, a different person, who is porting the original Mortal Kombat to the Atari Jaguar. Does anyone remember the Atari Jaguar, the first 64-bit video game system in the 90s? Old technology. There's another guy whose name I at least know, Kays Emenauer. And if you're into Nintendo 64, you should know about him. Not only making homebrew games for Nintendo 64, but finding ways to optimize and correct the code of the programming of classic games to make them run better. He has been able to make a Nintendo 64 run high resolution, 60 frames per second, with a Mario 64 hack that is effectively Super Mario Galaxy for the GameCube, which is a 128-bit system. The reason I'm mentioning this is there's also people making things like the EverDrive. Retro gaming is in vogue. There's a reason for that. Only a handful of video games that have come out have actually been any good recently. Some of them are visually impressive, but their writing is lacking, or their game plot or gameplay is lacking, or they're the same basic premise over and over again. Or, even worse, a freaking million different video games, all using the Unreal Engine, because these game designers can't be bothered to create their own engine. So what we have is, at present, the remake-itis, or the woke turns everything to shit mentality going on in video gaming. No matter where you look, you're paying exorbitant prices for game consoles that may or may not succeed, because there's no guarantee that any console will succeed. Doesn't matter if this is the 5th iteration of PlayStation. This could be the one that bombs. This doesn't matter, what version of your Xbox it is. This could be the one that bombs. If they don't support it with good games, it will bomb. That's what happened with Jaguar. That's what happened with 3DO. That's not what happened with Nintendo 64. Nintendo 64, however, had limitations at the time that now have been overcome, as far as RAM and storage and such. Not to mention emulation. My point is, we are at a point now where the only real threat to the ability to retro game and to create new retro style games on retro consoles is if the assets being used are somehow copyright claimed by the original authors of the games, or the original copyright holders, like, say, the video game companies if it's a first party game, or whatever the legalities are. Because technically, if you download a bunch of classic video game ROMs, you're violating copyright. You're pirating, basically, to have these. But at the same time, they're not available. They're not in production anymore. So if somebody rips it for an archive and then distributes it to other people, those other people have an archive. You are able to preserve history this way. And this is what I hope that the video game companies recognize, is the preservation of history. Because without this history, the stuff that they're doing now is less than meaningless, less than pointless. What they're doing now is an extension of what is being archived and preserved. However, if you compare the difficulty and satisfaction of the games that you played back then versus the ones that you're playing now, you're going to notice a significant difference, which is why retro gaming is so in vogue right now. And there's people making Flash games and modern, applications that, far exceed what the consoles are capable of. And these people are coding it themselves, which is awesome. But the thing is, because these guys are still dedicated to systems like 3DO, Jaguar, Nintendo 64, there are people making games for Genesis. There are people making games for NES and Super Nintendo. The possibility exists for a thriving underground independent game creation community, which already exists, mind you, but for it to become more available to the mainstream. This possibility exists. It's a marvelous thing to think about. As much as people are able to expand and further maximize with decades of retrospect, of hindsight into how these systems function, how their data allocation and acquisition processing, and each game system is architecturally built different, and therefore each system that you work with, you would have to understand that architecture when it comes to writing the operating code of the game. So just having the same code from a PlayStation disc, putting it into a 3DO will not run it unless that 3DO is somehow gifted with PlayStation emulation, which is not really a thing that well. You can do it on your PC, but not with another existing 32-bit console. But what you can do is master the architecture of that console using modern knowledge, decades again of people having, been able to study it, go over it, isolate and locate, loopholes or things to avoid when it comes to programming for those systems. And as such, enables people to further push the limits of these video game consoles than whatever the final game of the system was able to do. Which, if you played the Sega Genesis, you know that they were, in fact, definitely pushing the limits. And Super Nintendo, the same. Nintendo 64, they just actually, honestly, I think they were able to see the limit, but they never really pushed it. There were some games that kind of did, frame rate wise, but the stuff that Caze has done proves that more efficient programming and further advanced knowledge that we possess now would allow someone to program games for these consoles that far exceed anything that ever came out for them, and in some cases can approach the level of performance of the next generation after that, of that brand's technology. You can program NES games that are almost as good as a Super Nintendo game. You can program Genesis games that look like 32-bit. You can program Nintendo 64 games that look like GameCube games, Wii games. So anyways, I just wanted to mention that I think it's really cool. And the era we're in right now, not only that, okay, there's a YouTuber named Tedrusis. He's in the Mortal Kombat community. He has participated, along with a number of others, in effectively rewriting the original arcade ROMs of the 3 Mortal Kombat games that appeared in arcades. Adding things, high definition. Then there's the Mugen community, which is a build your own fighting game, and people have hacked out all the Mortal Kombat sprite assets. And boy, let me tell you, there's some crazy stuff been done there, for the good and for the bad. Point is, it's already been strong, but it's at a point where I feel like there can almost be a watershed moment where people get so tired of paying $500+ for a console. That's what 3DO cost back in the day. In the 90s, it was a $500 system. So you're forking out. You got to pay another $150 if you want that console to have a hard drive. If you want it to be able to do the super HD 4K to your TV or whatever might be an additional option. There's like 3 or 4 option levels for PS5, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, it's a racket, it's a grift. the content that they put out for these consoles, I think, is subpar. Yeah, it's graphically flashy, but most of these games are taking the exact same formula. So whether you're playing Halo or whether you're playing Elden Ring or whether you're playing whatever, you're either in an open world role playing situation or you are in some kind of a checkpoint to checkpoint action scenario, if it isn't sprites on your screen. Games have become so, I don't know, ingrained into this way of making them. This is the way people play. Everybody's, just got to make that checkpoint, just got to make that checkpoint. And it's like, back in the day, you didn't have that. And in the modern era of playing with emulation, you can use save states to substitute checkpoints so that if something bad happens, you just go back to the last save state and keep going. And, if the game programs that in, then, it's like hitting the little dinger thing on Sonic, and, if you die, you come back there. But the modern games have little arrows on screen that point you to where you're going. So you're really just following the arrow until you reach the point, and then following the arrow until you reach the next point, doing things in between. The goal of the game becomes to follow the arrow to the next point, not to do the other things in between, is what I'm getting at. These old games really didn't have that. You had instructions on screen. They said what you needed to do, and everything else was about you figuring out the puzzle for yourself or consulting, a walkthrough. But we have the possibility to get new video games of the classic variety, as long as there are people willing to work on them, people who are interested in programming them, and people who are willing to play them. But I think the people being willing to play them is going to increase with time, because there has been an incredible backlash in the gaming community against the gaming industry as of late. And that's what kind of concerns me, is like, on one hand, this golden age of retro new gaming is possible. But when those big game companies drive everyone away from their garbage product, they're then going to get upset that somebody has been pirating their old stuff. And rather than make their new stuff as good as the old stuff, they will crack down on the people who are trying to get engaged with the old stuff. It's kind of where it is. Anyways, if you haven't had a chance, do a search for Mortal Kombat Atari Jaguar, or Mortal Kombat 2 Panasonic 3DO, or Nintendo 64 Mario 60 FPS. You will be amazed at the stuff you can find that people are doing right now in the current year with this ancient technology, and how it tends to be of a superior caliber to the dreck that is being put out by big gaming.